Hey, what's going on everyone? Michael here. Today I'm going to be talking about aquarium plant health. So regardless of whether or not you have a high-tech or a low-tech system, there are some basic demands that all aquarium plants have, and that never changes. I've broken it down into three basic pillars of health: light, CO2, and nutrition. I'll dive into all those topics in greater detail in this video, and I'll explain why each of them is important for plant health. I personally find it interesting, but more importantly than that, I think that it's going to really help you understand what your plants need and put you in a better situation to give them the care that they need so that you can end up with a lush, healthy planted tank. Light is one of the most obviously important factors when it comes to growing aquarium plants. I think that everyone knows you need light to grow plants, whether or not they live underwater. When you think about it, plants are super cool organisms in the way that they can produce their own food using light, water, and CO2 in a process called photosynthesis. Basically what happens is there's a pigment inside plants called chlorophyll, and it's able to absorb sunlight as solar energy and use that to break apart carbon dioxide and water in order to create food for itself. Let's take a closer look at how that works. The process is called photosynthesis. Basically what happens is plants take in water and carbon dioxide. Then they absorb sunlight, or the aquarium light that you've provided for them. The light is harnessed by that pigment chlorophyll as energy and used to split part of the water molecule off and add it onto the carbon dioxide. As a result, the water is converted to oxygen, which is great for your fish, and the carbon dioxide is turned into sugars, which your plants use as food. So now that we know what plants use light for, it's time to talk about wavelengths. That superpigment that I talked about, chlorophyll, isn't able to just use any wavelength of light. It requires light with a specific wavelength in the red, blue, and green color spectrums. Now the way that lights used to be sold is that you would see a little chart on the back of those lights, and they would have spikes in the red, blue, and green wavelengths, usually marked in some sort of 3 to 600 nanometer wavelengths. What's more common nowadays is you'll see Kelvin. So 6,500 to 7,000 Kelvin is normally what's sold for planted tanks. And I would stick more with that 6,500 Kelvin because that's going to be a full spectrum. That means it contains all of the other visible light spectrums, and it more closely resembles natural sunlight. Alright, time to talk about carbon dioxide. All aquarium plants need carbon dioxide to survive. It's just as important as light. Without both the right color spectrum of light and carbon dioxide, no plant can photosynthesize. Now, that doesn't mean you have to rush and go out and buy a CO2 injection kit for your planted tank. Carbon dioxide is actually already present in your tank, even if you're not using CO2 injection. That's because our atmosphere actually has a decent amount of carbon dioxide that dissolves from the air into your tank. It's also present in tap water, fish get rid of it through their gills when they respire, and some microbial life expels it as a byproduct of respiration. A lot of municipalities, in America at least, inject CO2 into their tap water to help reduce the corrosive properties on infrastructure. And so I was actually able to hop on my city's website and verify that they are injecting CO2 into the tap water. If you think about CO2 as something that goes hand in hand with light, it's a lot easier to understand how it works. So basically, when a plant photosynthesizes, it takes light and CO2 at the same time to break that CO2 apart. So if we have a really strong light that's blasting the tank, it could quickly deplete the carbon dioxide source. And then at that point, there's nothing left for the plants to utilize. That light is just being wasted. I mean, really, the whole point of the light is just to break carbon dioxide apart. So if you have a super strong light on your tank and no carbon dioxide, chances are you're wasting your money on that light, and it's likely going to result in a lot of algae growth. Last but not least of the three major plant pillars, there are a ton of different micro and macronutrients, including nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, iron, boron, molybdenum, and zinc. Sometimes these nutrients are important for plants' growth, like they're actually the building blocks of those plants. while other times these chemicals or nutrients are important for chemical processes that take place inside the plant. A lot of these are really complicated, and I'm not really going to get into those. So what's the best way to get your plants the nutrients they need? There's three main ways to do that. One is in planted soil, two, liquid fertilizer, and three, fish waste. Planted soil is really important for any planted tank, in my opinion. You can use root tabs in sand, but it's not quite the same thing. The roots grow a lot better in this clay-based substrate or soil, and it provides a really good home for beneficial bacteria. The liquid fertilizers should be used with planted soil. It'll help increase the lifespan of the planted soil because plants aren't only drawing from their roots, but pulling from the water column. And then fish waste is really great to kind of subsidize the fertilizers you're using, and it's kind of cool to think about your plants as eliminating fish waste in the water column, but I wouldn't really rely on fish waste as a consistent source of nutrients for your plants because they really only contain a few elements and they're missing a lot of the smaller ones. There is actually one last place where nutrients can enter your aquarium, and that's from your tap water. That really depends on where you live though. So where I live in Colorado, I'm about half an hour from the mountains and we get really high quality tap water. But we had a really large wildfire the other year, and as a result, a bunch of the trees have burned down and mudslides are really prevalent when there is big rainfall. And that can cause a spike in phosphates and nitrates in tap water, but it's pretty inconsistent, and in general, I wouldn't really rely on tap water as a source of nutrients for your plants. The best way to get really healthy plant growth is to find a good balance between the three pillars. And when I talk about healthy plant growth, I don't just mean lush, thriving plants, but I mean plants that aren't smothered in algae. Like I mentioned before, these pillars go hand in hand. If they're missing one important pillar, they're not going to be able to utilize the others. Because algae is able to grow in harsher conditions than plants, it will take advantage of any imbalance in the three pillars of plant health. That's why we tend to see a lot of algae in plants with really strong lights and no CO2 or fertilizer. If you do manage to get your three pillars balanced, you'll notice that a healthy plant community is actually the best way to repel algae. That's because healthy plants are able to absorb nutrients much quicker than algae, and they're able to actually repel algae from growing on their leaves. So how do you strike this balance between all three elements that I've talked about? Well, the best way to do that is to start slowly. Every time I set up a new planted tank, I have the lights on about 50%, and I don't even use fertilizers the first few days. I gradually ease into things, and by the time the tank is done cycling and plants have filled in, I'll have the lights and fertilizers cranked up to where I want them. CO2 is a different story. I always start with 30 parts per million carbon dioxide. So what are some other things to think about when it comes to plants? There are factors like temperature, pH, flow, and hardness that do affect plant growth, but they're not nearly as important as the three pillars of plant growth. Most plants do actually better in slightly cooler water, like low to mid 70s Fahrenheit, 22, 23 Celsius. They usually do well with moderate flow at a minimum, kind of softer water, and a little bit more on the acidic side. Granted, I don't really mess around with these things. Obviously, it's easy to control your temperature and flow, but when it comes to altering water parameters, I gave that up with my reef tank. I'm not messing around with pH or hardness anymore. If a plant does well in my tank, great, I'll keep it. Even in this, my high-tech tank, there have been a couple plants that haven't done well, and that's fine. I just don't keep them. Everything else is happy, and I'm happy. Now, if you do live somewhere with really extreme tap water, you can get a reverse osmosis system. Basically, that takes your tap water and removes everything from it, and then you start from scratch. You need to remineralize it and buffer that. So the last thing to think about, which is really fun for me, is what kind of environment do these plants live in nature? You know, we think about that with fish a lot. How do we replicate their natural environment to get them to breed and be healthy? But we don't really hear people talk about that nearly as much with plants. And truth of the matter is, most of these plants actually live in a completely different way in nature. they live in climates that have wet seasons and dry seasons. And so oftentimes these plants never actually live fully submerged underwater. They might live on the margins of a stream, and then when that stream is in, high flow season, those plants are partially or sometimes fully submerged underwater. But the fact that there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than underwater is one of the reasons that these plants do so well when we pump carbon dioxide in the water. It's closer to the levels that they naturally experience. And another thing is, most of these plants are found in really slow flowing creeks and ponds that are full of algae and detritus. This is not a natural way that these plants grow. This is an underwater garden. And I'm completely fine with that. I love stinky ponds. I love hiking, and maybe I'll even go for a swim in a stinky pond, but that's really not what I want in my home. I want a lush underwater garden. It makes me happy, and I'm fine with that, knowing that it's not completely natural. Anyways, I hope this video was useful for you, not only learning about what's important for aquarium plants, but why those things are important. That way you can make the choice when it comes to whether or not you should be providing CO2 or fertilizers or this kind of light or that kind of light. And as always, thanks for watching. Appreciate your support for this channel. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button if you've enjoyed today's content. And don't be shy, stick around, watch some other stuff. See ya!